Without further ado, welcome environmental advocates. With the release of Virginia Conservation Network's R2023 Common Agenda briefing book, Virginia's environmental advocates and policymakers have access to our upcoming environmental policy goals. As with each year's agenda, the over 38 issue papers have been crafted by our over 150 plus network partners. Each Thursday in October and the first week of November, so this week and actually next week, this is our second to last one, we've been having these 11 a.m. to 12:30 educational series events that are meant to highlight the state-based policy recommendations throughout our 5 chapters. We have covered clean water and flood resilience. We have covered land use and transportation, climate and energy. Today we'll be covering good governance and the Virginia state budget. And then next week will be land and wildlife conservation. But without further ado, I'd like to pass it off to Pat.
Thanks, Kyle. My name is Pat Coward. I'm Senior Policy Campaign Manager for VCN. Thank you for joining this morning, and I want to thank our presenters in advance for their work in advance of this and leading up to today. It's my honor to introduce you to start off with our environmental equity discussion. And Mark Sabath of Southern Environmental Law Center will be speaking on promoting environmental justice. After Mark will be Helen Kuhns with Lynnhaven River Now, who will be speaking on education for an environmental literacy in Virginia. And afterwards, we'll entertain we'll have our presenters entertain your questions. And what we'd like to do is ask you to just enter any questions you have for our presenters using the Q&A button there at the bottom of your screen. And then we'll do our best in the time allotted to entertain your questions. And then afterwards, we're going to get into the Budget 101 webinar. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it right over to Mark Sabath of Southern Environmental Law Center.
All right. I am just sharing my screen. All right. Thank you, Kyle and Pat, and thank you all for being here. I'm Mark Sabath from the Southern Environmental Law Center and worked on this policy paper with co-authors Peter Anderson of Appalachian Voices, Jay Ford of the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, and Faith Harris of Virginia Interfaith Power and Light. In Virginia, as elsewhere, we know that people of color and low-income individuals are more likely to live near polluting facilities, other environmental hazards. They're also less likely to benefit from environmental benefits like green space and access to public transit. And all of these combined cause significant risks to the health and well-being of many members of the Commonwealth. And so environmental justice, as you know, is all about making sure that all people have access to information about environmental policy decisions and a voice in those decisions, and making sure that those decisions don't disproportionately harm communities of color and low-income communities. Have we made progress in the last couple of years? Yes, we have. In 2020, as you know, the General Assembly passed the Virginia Environmental Justice Act, which made it the policy of the Commonwealth to promote environmental justice and ensure it's carried out throughout Virginia. And that means trying to guarantee fair treatment and meaningful involvement of every person in environmental decision-making. In 2021, the State Air Pollution Control Board really considered environmental justice in weighing a permit for the Lambert compressor station, ended up denying that permit by finding that the station would have posed an unfair burden due to the air emissions from the station on an African-American community in the vicinity of that proposed facility. In 2022, the James River Water Authority, which had been planning to build a water intake on the James River on a sacred Monacan Indian Nation site, abandoned those plans thanks to pressure and advocacy from the Monacan Indian Nation and supporters. But unfortunately, these victories have been the exception, not the norm. We haven't seen much evidence that our state agencies are taking concrete steps to incorporate consideration of environmental justice into their activities. Of course, last year, the General Assembly passed legislation stripping permitting authority from the air and water boards, citizen boards, and which erodes public involvement, including involvement from environmental justice community members. And we've also still seen a number of proposed projects that would have impacts on communities of color, low-income communities, from a landfill in Cumberland County to the gas pipeline, the Virginia Reliability Project in southeastern Virginia, to a proposal to mine, do gold mining in Buckingham County. Those are just a few examples. So we still have work to do, and we in this paper have proposed 4 policy solutions to sort of further carry out the goals of the Virginia Environmental Justice Act. The first is to require appropriate state agencies to develop and implement official environmental justice policy. So these would be agencies within the Secretariats of Natural and Historic Resources, Transportation, Commerce and Trade, and Health and Human Resources. These policies would govern how the agencies identify environmental justice communities, how they engage with those communities, and to develop a process for considering the effects of their activities on these communities. The second and third recommendations or policy solutions both have to do with environmental permitting. So one is to require agencies to develop meaningful public participation processes, process that would involve consulting early with affected communities on a potential permit, and grant those communities meaningful involvement throughout the permitting process, early and often throughout the process. And then tied into that, the third policy solution related, and the second one related to environmental permitting, is requiring agencies to consider whether the issuance of a permit would cause disproportionate adverse impacts on low-income communities or communities of color. And as part of that, empower those agencies to require alternative sites for facilities or deny permits in appropriate cases. And finally, our final solution is to maintain the integrity and the independence of the Virginia Council on Environmental Justice. This is a group of environmental justice experts and community members who develop recommendations for a framework for Virginia to understand and address problems of environmental injustice and to further promote environmental justice in the Commonwealth. So maintaining the integrity of that council is also critical. With that, I will stop my share and turn it back to Pat.
Thank you very much, Mark. Appreciate your time, and hang on. We'll if you have any questions for Mark, please put those in using the Q&A button down at the bottom. And in a few minutes, we'll return to those questions. So Helen Kuhns from Lynnhaven River Now, as well as the Virginia Association for Environmental Education, will be speaking with us now on educating for environmental literacy, an issue which I'm pretty prone to support, having been an environmental educator for the first half of my career. So without further ado, Helen, all yours.
I'm here. Thank you, Pat. I appreciate it. Good morning, everyone. My name is Helen Kuhns, and I work with Lynnhaven River Now in Virginia Beach, Virginia, and was a founding board member and continue as an active board member of the Virginia Association for Environmental Education, also referred to as VAEE. I had the privilege of co-authoring this paper with 2 amazing people, Daria Christian from Friends of the Rappahannock and also from VAEE, and Christy Everett of the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. Educating for Environmental Literacy is only the 3rd paper written for VCN's Our Common Agenda, requesting support for environmental education in Virginia. You can review the first 2 papers in our Common Agenda publications from 2021 and 2022. With the successes from our 2021 and 2022 asks still undergoing development, the 2023 paper focuses on the bricks and mortar of environmental education in the Commonwealth. Our teachers, both formal and non-formal, must possess the skills and understanding to ensure an environmentally literate, motivated citizenry. Environmental education has an important place in the preparation of our children for the future decisions they face. It is our responsibility to see that the education they receive holistically prepares them for the challenges ahead. Our next generation of environmental engineers and stewards begins with meaningful environmental education. The challenges as outlined in this slide speak to, first, the environmental challenges ahead, which will require an environmentally literate Virginia, with each individual having the knowledge and motivation to act. Secondly, the need for preparation of our students to be stewards of, our stewards of natural resources and public health. And finally, the essential task of providing our teachers with environmentally specific training to effectively educate our students of the Commonwealth. So this means that we must take an in-depth look at the education and training systems currently in place. Limited environmental education exists within our current structure. Areas that are lacking must be identified, and our educators must be brought to a level of training and competency that allows them to comfortably integrate environmental education across the curriculums. Most teachers today have received little to no environmental education training in their preparation for licensure. In order to meet the challenges, a study has been requested. This study should look into the gaps as well as the opportunities available to our educators and help to build a bridge for training with special consideration to those working with underserved populations that often bear the weight of inequitable environmental decision-making. Incentivizing environmental education training and utilizing certification programs such as that available through the Virginia Association for Environmental Education could allow teachers to gain endorsements to their licensure and pay scale increases on completion. The solutions we outlined include, first, the creation of this study through the Department of Conservation and Recreation, the Department of Education, and the State Council of Higher Education for Virginia. The study will look at the possibilities of incentivizing teachers to participate in Virginia-centric environmental education trainings. Secondly, the study should consider the integration of current environmental curriculums and certifications, such as those available through Virginia Association for Environmental Education. And lastly, the study should prioritize the needs of underserved school districts. We feel that this study could open the doorway for our teachers and pre-service teachers to adequately prepare them and effectively teach the necessary concepts, earn the recognition for their hard work and success, and provide our students with environmental literacy required to be engaged and knowledgeable citizens of tomorrow. Thank you.
I appreciate it, Helen. Appreciate that very much. So if you have any questions, please do put those in the bottom. At this time, I do not have any specific policy questions related to what you've presented. So we can always come back if need be, but if there are none at this time, great job. It means you did it all perfectly, succinctly, and concisely, and fully. I think at this point, then we'll move right over to our state budget training. And this was intended as a way to engage, introduce the entire budget process in Virginia, which is critical towards conservation, but also quite mysterious and unintuitive and scary sometimes to some folks. So Nick Donohue from Capital Transportation Consulting and Anna Killius from James River Association are both what I consider to be experts in effectively advocating for the budget and understanding the whole budget process, how it works, and how to actually become engaged in it. So they were kind enough to offer their assistance to provide sort of an insider's view of how you might also benefit from their knowledge. And I'm calling this Budget 101 training. So first off, I'm going to hand it over to Nick Donohue, Honorable Nick Donohue with Capital Transportation Consulting.
Well, thanks so much, Pat, and thanks everyone for the opportunity to be with you here this morning. Ann and I are going to be kind of tag teaming this presentation, so at times when I'm talking, she may jump in and vice versa there. And so, first again, just thank you all for being here. And I think, Nicole, there was a slide deck as well, as you can pull that up. Great, thank you so much. And so, just as we kind of start here, just really want to start with some basics. We talk a lot about the budget or the Appropriations Act. As Pat said, it is an extremely, extremely important document. It's also very, very long. It typically clocks in around 600-700 pages. The reason why the budget is just so important, particularly for the efforts of folks on this call, is obviously one, it governs how all of the funds from the general fund and other state dollars and trust funds and other accounts are used. And so if you want to spend money and you're a department or agency of the Commonwealth, you need that funding to be included in the budget. The other thing that's not always talked about as much is the budget really is kind of overrules all existing state law. And so if there's ever a provision in law that says one thing and then a provision in the budget that says something else, the budget wins. And so there's been a trend that's we've kind of increased in recent years where not only does the budget talk about how funding is to be allocated and used, but there's also a lot of times policy provisions that can be included in the budget. So the budget is a extremely, extremely important, document there. The other thing I would kind of say about the budget is we think about the process, and Pat talked about it can be mysterious and scary, and I'll say that even for folks like Anna and myself who've dealt with the budget a lot, it still can be a scary process. So that's just kind of part of the baked into the cake when it comes to the budget. A lot of the discussion about the budget is really, and focus, particularly if you're just reading the newspapers, is in what happens, from December when the governor announces the budget to, April, typically when the budget is resolved and the governor signs it. But the budget process is actually a 12-month process. Once they finish one budget, the state really kind of, and the agencies start right over again. And so this is not a process where you can, if you want to effectively engage and try to, influence some of the outcomes, that you can start in January and really hope for success, at the end of April. This is an ongoing process where the engagement is really necessary throughout the year. And so this slide here talked about the kind of two key components of the budget process. The first one being kind of how does a budget actually get developed? So again, I told you it's 700 pages. That is a concerted effort of state government to put together a document of that size, scope, and scale, and to ensure it accurately reflects the intentions of the administration. And then the second part is like, once the budget has been put together, what does the legislature do with it? How do they debate it? How do they decide how they want to modify that budget? And again, as I said, this process is ongoing, and I cannot stress how important it is to engage in this sooner rather than later. And so if we go to the next slide, some of the things we're talking about for the upcoming session, they've already happened. And so when the budget is signed by the governor in April or May, or in some years, a little bit later, what happens then, it becomes effective on July 1. And at that point, the agencies are already starting to work on their budget requests for the next General Assembly session. There's then a formal process that takes place working with the Department of Planning and Budget, who is kind of the gatekeeper and owner of the budget within the executive branch, where all of the agency requests for what do they want to see and what do they hope to be included in the next governor's budget are submitted to the Department of Planning and Budget. And very, very importantly for you all as advocates and citizens, this information is all put online. And so if you go to the website address that's listed here, you click the tab Agency Submissions, you can look at every request made by every agency for the upcoming budget. And so, for example, I used to do transportation when I was in the governor's office. If you click on transportation and go to this website now, you can see that the Port of Virginia wants to repurpose several existing tax credits that they have for a different outcome, and you can see some of those details there. And so if there's things that you would like to see in the governor's introduced budget, it is very, very helpful to be talking with agency leadership and other folks before this August to September timeframe, when they have to make these submissions to the governor's office and to the cabinet secretaries to kind of request modifications or things to be included in the budget. And as we talk about that, why is it important to be in the governor's included budget? There's really two ways to think about this. If something is in the budget, the General Assembly has to vote to remove it. And there are a lot of times where the Assembly is willing to allow something to remain in the budget that the governor submitted, but they may not necessarily vote to add it themselves if it's not included in the governor's introduced budget. So anytime you want something in the budget, your goal should be to try and work with whatever the administration may be, first with the agencies and then with the cabinet secretaries, to get those items included in the governor's introduced budget, because that dramatically increases the likelihood that that funding or that provision will be able to kind of stay in the budget as it works its way through the legislative process. If we go to the next slide. So where we currently are right now, as I said, the agencies have made all of their submissions and they're currently being reviewed first by the cabinet secretaries. And then once the cabinet secretaries have either signed off, modified, or otherwise declined agency request, those that were approved or the modified approved versions will be forwarded on to the governor's office, who ultimately will make the final decisions with the governor working with the Secretary of Finance and the Department of Planning and Budget on what items are going to be included in the governor's introduced budget. And again, just to put a really fine point on why being in the introduced budget is so important, the administration, if there's new spending they want to see and they put it in the introduced budget, they will balance the budget. And so if you want $5 million to go to X conservation purpose, and it's in that the governor's introduced budget, you don't have to figure out how to pay for that $5 million. But if you're working with a legislature during session and they submit a budget amendment that requests $5 million, a lot of times the money committees will want to understand, well, where would you like to see that $5 million come from? Or they'll have to try and figure out where to eliminate a certain amount of spending to be able to pay for what is now considered a new initiative that is otherwise, unpaid for. And again, that's just a really, really high hurdle. One other thing I would be remiss if I didn't talk about when it comes to the governor's office and the secretary's office is sometimes cabinet secretaries or the governor's office will include things in the budget that were not requested by agencies. And so while the DPB website gives you great insight into what agencies have requested, that doesn't mean that something that you didn't see on that DPB website might not show up in the governor's introduced budget, which if you go to the next slide, that comes out in December when the governor speaks to the joint money committees, which is when the Senate Finance and Appropriations Committee, the House Appropriations Committee, and the House Finance Committees meet to hear the governor's kind of quote budget speech. And when that happens, the budget is made available. You can figure out what is finally and actually included in that introduced budget there and see, was this request from the agency? Did it make it through the approval process? Is there a new surprise that wasn't in, any agency request that's now included in there? But this becomes the base version of the budget that is considered by the Assembly when they come in January. One other thing that we should, is important is the budget is a 2-year document. And so it covers, a biennium is what they call it. And so there's always the first year and the second year of a budget. And so in even number years, that is when a new budget covering a new biennium or 2-year period is introduced by a governor. In odd years, what the legislature does is considers amendments to a previously approved biennial budget. So that's why sessions are longer in even number years, because there's more budget issues to deal with when that brand new budget for a biennium that hasn't started is considered by the assembly. And so the current session we're getting ready to go into, they will be looking at what they call kind of the caboose bill, where they're amending an existing budget that they adopted this past year. Next slide. So after the governor's budget proposal is introduced in December, the House Appropriations and Senate Finance and Appropriations Committees hold regional hearings the first week of January before session starts all across the Commonwealth. And this is a great opportunity for citizens and advocates and others to be able to speak directly to key members of these committees to talk about their priorities, things that are in the budget that you really like, things that are in the budget you don't like, or things that you would really like to see in the budget that currently aren't included. And this is a great way to talk to folks, in where you live, and to have them hear kind of from you. But one thing, again, I want to really talk about here is when it comes to session and engaging with legislators, and I said this at the outset, if you wait until session to make it clear to your senator or your delegate what is really important for you in the budget, it dramatically lowers your chances of success for seeing your priorities kind of reflected in the budget. And the reason for that is, if you think about what does a senator or delegate have to do when they get to session, this is the single most busy time of the entire year for these individuals. So they get to Richmond, 2,000, 3,000 bills have been introduced. They have their own legislation that they've introduced. There are teams and teams of lobbyists roaming the building with the General Assembly, meeting and talking with these folks about issues. And if the first time you try to reach out to your legislator about a priority is during this extremely hectic period of time, chances are you may not be able to get a lot of time with them. In certain cases, you may not even be able to kind of connect with them. Or if you do, there's just a lot of other things kind of flying through the air there. And so always try and engage with these folks in advance of when they actually get to Richmond and have to start working through the session, because it's just a very, very hectic and busy time. So the public hearings happen the week before session. Then during the first week of session, that is when members, both senators and delegates, have to submit any budget amendment requests they would like to see to change the governor's introduced budget to the appropriations and finance committees to kind of request that change. When the members do that, what then happens is they have the opportunity to then testify before the committee to express the importance of a given budget amendment. And again, those are then considered by the committee. So to the next slide, and I think Anna, is this where you pick up?
Yeah. And just to put a real fine point on what Nick said, in that first week of session, you're going to have the members dealing with interchamber relationships. They're going to be dealing with inter-party relationships. They're going to be trying to drop budget amendments and finish all the legislation that they want to offer that year, make sure that those are all ready to go. So that is a lot that office is handling. So if you want a member to offer a budget amendment on your behalf, you really should be talking to them now, even before the budget comes out, so that they're aware of what you may come in with once you see the budget proposal from the governor. So setting that aside, now we have all of the member amendments. They've all been dropped. They're all online. You can look through them all and identify which ones you care about or want to follow. At this point, all of those are going to be taken up by the subcommittees of the two, what we call money committees. So the House Appropriations Committee and the Senate Finance and Appropriations Committee. Those subcommittees are kind of the subject matter experts for that part of the bill. So they're going to be going through all of the member amendments that they've received for their part of the bill and looking at which ones do we like, which ones do we not like, what can we do, what edits can we propose to the bill to help make members feel like they're having some say in the bill process. The subcommittee recommendations are going to be delivered to the full committee, and then leadership of the committee and the full committee are going to grapple with the numbers and figure out what can we accept, what can't we accept, what moves can we make within the budget. So at this period of time, you should be engaging with the leaders of the full committees and with the members of the relevant appropriations subcommittees that are looking at those amendments that you care about. Really make sure they understand what they're looking at and why it's important, and what you want to see done with that particular amendment. Be really specific about the amendment number that you are referring to and what your request is for that amendment. Amendments are identified by the part of the bill that they are amending. So there's an item number. So say you have item number 274, and then they are identified by how many amendments were offered to that item number. So you may be dealing with the second amendment offered to that item number in the House. And so it has amendment number 274, number 2H. And that is how you will identify that amendment through this period of time. And you need to make sure you know those numbers and you are accurately identifying them for the people that need to see them. It's also important at this period of time, only speak to House members about House amendments and Senate members about Senate amendments. They are not looking at the other chamber's bill at this period of time. So make sure that you are talking to them about the thing that they are looking at and can make a difference on during this period. So once you have the subcommittees taking their recommendations to the full committee and the full committee looking through those and making their full recommendation, that is what is called a committee report. The House will put out its committee report and the Senate will put out its committee report. These are what they plan to do to the full bill on behalf of their chamber. And be aware that once those committee reports come out, all of the amendment numbers change because now they wipe the decks of how many amendments there were. And the only things moving forward are the amendments that they've accepted. So double check here when you're on the website, be looking at the committee approved amendments and make sure you know the new numbers that are moving forward. Some things to think about. If your amendment shows up in both committee reports, you're in pretty good shape. It means the committees, the chambers agree. So, you know, you've got the wind behind your back at this point. If you only show up in one committee report, that's a good thing. That's something to work with. It's still in the conversation. You're going to want to make a real case for why it should show up in the final bill with the committee that didn't accept it before. And if your amendment doesn't show up in either committee report, you have the hardest road ahead of you because now it's kind of out of the conversation for when they're negotiating between the differences of the two bills. So you're going to really have to make a statement for why they should pull this amendment out of, you know, the trash bin and bring it back into the conversation. Or you need to start talking to the governor's staff about why they should consider this as a potential amendment down the line. So next slide. All right, so you have your two committee reports, House and Senate. These are going to go to the floor of their respective chamber for a full vote by the body sometime in February or March, depending on how long the session is. At this point, it's important to remember members can still offer an amendment on the floor. So say they didn't get what they wanted out of the two money committees, well, they can bring it again now when the bill is on the floor of the chamber. And this is where we have the least ability to impact what happens in that room because you find out pretty late. I mean, these amendments show up in the calendar, the daily calendar that's printed. They may not show up on LIS much before they're considered, if at all. So you really need to have prepared your champions in that chamber to be aware of what might be coming, who might be bringing an amendment or trying to make a change to something that you want to see stay the same, and prepared people ahead of time. So when they walk onto the floor, they can do the heavy lifting because you can't really do anything anymore. Everything's going to happen in that chamber, and you really can't get to them while they're voting. So now the amendments have been offered. Maybe some amendments have been accepted. The bill has been passed by both chambers. At this point in the procedure, they're going to swap bills. The bill is going to go to the House bill will go to the Senate side. The Senate bill will go to the House side. And then without much debate or consideration, they're just going to reject the other chamber's bill. It's a little bit of a procedural thing. It's a little bit of a posturing thing, right? The House thinks it's the smartest. The Senate thinks it's the smartest. They're just going to say, we think our bill is better. Let's move this into negotiation. At this point, each chamber is going to name between 6 and 8 negotiators called conferees that are sent to resolve the differences between the 2 chambers and the 2 bills and create one conference report. How do you know who the conferees are? Well, usually they're leadership. They are the chairs of the money committees. They're senior members on the money committees. They're chairs of the important subcommittees of the money committees. They will be announced probably on the floor. They may show up in the daily minutes. And they may be posted on the committee's websites. So you're going to be looking for all these different cues for when the conferees are named. And usually within VCN, as soon as someone spots it, we'll send it around so everyone's aware. And those are the people to target for the next part of this saga. So next slide. Conference time. So I've created a literal black box here, but that's basically what you go into. The conferees are going to work out the differences. Their negotiations are not public. They are not noticed meetings. You cannot attend them. You don't know when they happen, if they happen in person at all. It's a lot of conversations between staff members as well from the 2 money committees. There's no record of what ends up on the scrap heap or where things are in the negotiations. So you're going to be looking at news reports. You're going to be checking in with your champions. You're going to be checking in with the conferees themselves if you happen to have a friend within the conference to figure out where things are. And then at this point, you really should be targeting all your outreach to those conferees so they know what you want to see. And this is where you really should be talking about both bills to both sides. So if you have an amendment in the House bill that you really like and it didn't show up in the Senate bill, talk to all the conferees about why the House version is better than the Senate version on that particular item, or vice versa. If it shows up in both, then maybe just flag that and say, this is great, you both accepted it, I hope it stays in. If it's something that didn't show up in either, then you need to point out why they really missed an opportunity, and that should be pulled from the scrap heap and make it into the final conference report. But those are the folks to target at this part of the process. Next slide. All right, so you have a conference report. I should have said this before. You have a conference report. The conferees have finished their negotiations. They've come up with one bill. Read through that bill, figure out how you fared, see if your priorities made it in or not. If they did, cheer, make a statement about how that's great that they're in there and that you hope the General Assembly passes those out and sends it to the governor that way. If they didn't make in there, point out why that's the wrong choice. Start making the case for why the governor, when he sees this conference report, should really try to put those things back in. The two chambers will vote on that conference report. That sends one bill, one negotiated same bill to the governor's desk, where he has a fixed amount of time to review that negotiated bill. This is roughly 4 weeks because he's got to get it done before they come back for veto session. His amendments, the things that he would like to see changed in that conference report, will be posted on LIS in advance. They're usually going to be policy issues or funding disputes that we've already heard about, have already been talked about during the regular session. So you've got some indication probably of where the governor's going to go, but you will see them all online ahead of time. So you can look through them and start deciding, do you want to support them? Do you want to oppose them? What do you want the General Assembly to do with those amendments? They're going to be taken up by the General Assembly during the veto session, and that starts the 6th Wednesday after adjournment of the regular session. So whenever they've all said goodbye in the regular session, you can start adding up those Wednesdays and know when the veto session is due to start. And that's when they'll take up that conference report again. They'll take up all the governor's amendments to it, and they'll grapple with what to do in the final bill. And I think one more slide. Oh, no, 2 more. Execution. So it's July, right? The bill has been signed. everything's set. If your budget request made it in, that's great. But are you done? No, not even close, because now the agencies responsible for that funding have to execute it. And you could just let them execute it on their own, figure out what it means and what you wanted, and just let that go. Or you could start talking to those agencies between now and July 1 about what they should be thinking about, how you thought about that budget language when you helped pitch it, how they should execute that budget language. And then on July 1, when that budget goes into effect and the agencies start to spend that money or fulfill those responsibilities in the budget language, they will have been informed by your words and what you've communicated about what they should be doing with that money and that authority. So don't let things go after the budget is signed in April. Be aware of who is responsible for making that budget request happen and start talking to them. And then last slide. Oh yeah.
Anna, really quick, if I could just add on that, I was in the executive branch. What Anna's saying is so important. Like getting the budget amendment, agencies may or may not know your intent. So that comes in. But also, if you don't tell them what you think the purpose or intent was, I assure you other people are. So it's not as if you're not engaging means they're kind of left to their own to ponder what the best, outcome might be. Anyone who had an opinion on your budget amendment during session is going to be engaging them. Their lobbyists are going to be engaging them. People who maybe didn't even think about your budget amendment until it passed, they're going to be engaging them. So like what Ann is saying here is so critically important, because once there's money there, a ton of people are going to pay attention to it, and they're going to give that agency all sorts of ideas, which hopefully are in line with what you intended. But if you assume that, like, that is a real risk that you're taking.
So cannot stress that one enough. So start early and then don't give up at the end. Keep talking to folks. So here's a recap. What should we do? What should you be doing throughout this process? This slide kind of lays out, again, where we are in the process and who you should be talking to. And take it with a grain of salt. This slide is kind of focused on the legislature. There's parts of this where you should be talking to the governor, you should be talking to the cabinet that aren't necessarily listed, but this is a good recap and reminder. So right now, you should be talking to the cabinet members, you should be talking to the governor's representatives, you should be talking to legislators, the staff for committees if necessary, talking to them about what priorities you have for funding and for budget authority. Make sure your message is clear, make sure that it's concise, make sure that you've got all your partners together on one common ask in preparation for when the governor's budget comes out December 15th. Then January, start testifying at public hearings, start appearing at committee meetings to see what they're talking about. Talk to your champions who are going to offer budget amendments for you. Talk to the subcommittees and the money committees so that they understand what those amendments will do and why they should support them. February, you're going to have your conferees being named. You're going to have negotiations happening. Start talking to those conferees. Start advocating for your top priorities. And then February, March, April, you should be thinking about what do you want the governor to do with the budget when he sees it? Do you need some last minute changes, or do you like a lot of what's in there and he really needs to leave those alone and sign it as is? So be aware where you are, who you should be talking to, and what's happening at that time. And that is it for our presentation, I think.
Woo, thank you, Anna and Nick. The budget saga. That's what I'm going to start calling it now, I think. So if you have any questions, by all means, you've got some great experts here on how the budget works and hints on how to be an effective advocate for it. So referring to the questions now, Monique Hannes offers one question. Thanks for covering the budget process. It is an intimidating topic. She also says, how do members handle unfunded projects that were passed by previously in previously passed bills laws? And she continues that I find it confusing that a law is on the books, but then remains unfunded, which in effect kills the program. And further, do admin agency leads feel compelled to fund such programs? I'll leave that to either of you to field.
Well, I'm happy to take a first shot at that, Pat, and then let Anna fill in and add to it. So, Monique, it all depends. And I know that's a really frustrating answer to give to a very specific question, but, you know, the administration, if they agree with the policy, they will try and find a way to fund it. If it was something that was passed 5 years ago and, you know, and it's not something that was funded in the last budget, and it's not something, a policy that they agree with, chances are they're probably not gonna fund it. And so, you know, there's plenty of times when the General Assembly passes a bill that does a program, maybe it gets funded in that biennium when it's passed, then there's an election, maybe the, you know, partisan makeup of the, you know, legislature changes or the party control of the governor's office changes, and there's no guarantee that that program is going to keep being funded into the future. I think what having a law on the books does is give advocates and citizens a great reason and a hook to really push for that funding. So having that on the books, I think, helps you all when you advocate the funds. But when it comes to like, what does an agency feel compelled to do, or what does a legislature do, or what does a governor do, it depends on whether that aligns with their priorities. Now, I would expect agencies, if a bill was passed that they like, will ask for that funding. But again, remember, the general fund is a zero-sum game. And so a lot of like conservation activities are in the general fund, and it is not, something not getting funded doesn't mean someone doesn't like it. It means they like something else more. And that's a really tough game to win. So you can like make a great case and be like, well, you know what, that is a great program. But then someone else might make a more persuasive case for something else from the general fund, or healthcare costs go up, or education, you know, costs go up, and all of a sudden there's $800 million that they have to carve out of the budget, and then these other things that were really interesting just don't get funded. And so it's a really tough kind of thing, particularly in the general fund.
Yeah, Nick, I think you covered it, but I'll add one thing that is tangentially related to this question, but worth pointing out. A lot of the times when a bill comes up before the money committee that would have an impact on the budget, just a regular bill, not a budget bill, but just a policy bill, and it would have an impact on the budget, you might find that a committee tags on a little line that says, this bill will only come into effect if it's funded. That's the money committee exerting a bit of control there and basically saying, you know, we get the last say on if this particular piece of legislation goes into effect, because if we don't put it in our budget, it's dead. So be aware of things like that can happen as you advocate for those policy changes, because the Appropriations Committee can exert a lot of control at the end of the day through this budget bill.
Yeah, and I think your comments actually go to another question that was in the thing, which is like, if the governor's budget allocates all the money, what happens if there's a bill that needs new money? And it's exactly what Anna said. That thing she referenced is, you know, if you hear someone talk about the clause, that is the dreaded clause. What it is this little provision at the end that says this only happens if we put money in the budget. And so if you look at a normal committee's agenda, so like the Natural Resources Committee, like an agenda there might have 10, 15, or even 20 bills on a busy day. If you look at the Senate Finance and Appropriations Committee agenda, it can be 70 or 80 bills long. And those meetings are like marathon meetings. And it's not fun, because you also don't know the order the bills are going to be heard in. And so you're sitting there listening to them talking about something entirely outside of like your issue area. And then randomly they call your bill, and you have to be, you know, completely prepared if you're in committee. But what they're doing there, Bob, to your question, is they're determining, are we going to reduce funding somewhere else to provide funding for this initiative? And so if the Senate wants to fund something, say they want to, you know, increase funding for widgets, and I'm just using a very, you know, simple term there, they're going to reduce funding for gadgets to then put it into widgets. Because it is, if you want to put $1 somewhere, you have to take it from somewhere else. And so that's what the clause is all about. That is the money committee saying, we're not going to pass bills that spend money we don't have. the state budget is always a balanced budget, unlike, the federal government where you don't have that same constraint. And so that's why the clause Anna was talking about exists. The appropriations and finance committees hear so many bills that are well beyond like what should tax rates be or other things of that nature. It is really saying, are we going to put money on something? So going to the committee is good in a way, but it also can be where a lot of hopes and dreams go, they don't live beyond that time. There's a certain staffer for one of the money committees who I won't name, but there's this final week right before crossover, which is when Anna talked about they passed the budgets in both chambers, and he referred to it lovingly as the week of hurt feelings. So you've gotten your bill out of the policy committee and you feel great. And then you go to the appropriations or finance committees, and that's when they're truly debating, are we going to fund this thing that the policies committee says is a great idea? And everyone thinks their thing is going to get funded. And the simple truth is there is never enough money to fund all of those great policy ideas that pass those policy committees. And so you have 100 ideas come in, and you're really lucky if 10 or 15 come out. And so that's the week of hurt feelings. That's when we actually have the serious discussion about what are we going to fund.
And so we'll just continue with Bob's question real quick, even though we haven't said it out loud fully. But another thing to think about is if you have a bill that you are working on or a study that you are requesting, and it's going to have a cost attached to it, you should be talking to that to your sponsor, your patron, about putting in the necessary budget amendment that goes in tandem with those two. Because if the budget committees if the appropriations committees are already talking about the need for that funding and the budget amendment that you've put in while they look at the policy, you're going to have a better chance of getting both through than if you just kind of surprise them with a bill that you also haven't identified a funding request for. So make sure that you're talking to your legislators where that's necessary so that both get done, and that they're prepared to make that a true priority of theirs to both pass the bill and make that funding request one of their top funding requests.
And again, that's why you want to be in the introduced budget. You let the administration balance it. You don't have to worry about where the other money comes from. There's not a public discussion about it. If it's in there, then it's already paid for, and it's much easier to keep something in the budget than it is to get something added to the budget, for better or worse.
Thank you all both. I've heard that many a time as well. I'll say it again. It's easier to get something, or it's harder. It's easier to remove something from the budget. I take it back. I'm saying it wrong. Nick said it right. It's easier to keep something in the budget that comes with the proposed budget than it is to offer it as an amendment and have it pulled out. So good advice. And now would be the time to really be doing that work, to really be talking to legislators and to mostly the administration and then legislators to make certain that it stays in the budget. So Nick, you mentioned federal funding, and Victoria offered a question. She just wants to know a little bit more about how federal and state funding work in the budget, and specifically cites funds coming from, for example, the IIJA or the IRA. Not that, but the Inflation Reduction Act.
Yeah, so Victoria, to that question, all funds, any dollar an agency is going to spend goes through the budget. It doesn't matter if it's a federal dollar that's flowing to the state or a dollar from a state, tax source. If an agency is going to spend it, it runs through the budget. The kind of the distinction is state funds are discretionary, and the General Assembly can choose how to use them, and particularly with the general fund, they can apply them for any purpose. Nothing in the budget can override the federal statute. So the federal statute says you're going to go plant maple trees at Pat's house. Then whether or not the General Assembly likes it, there is this bucket of money that's going to be in the budget that talks about the maple trees they're going to plant at Pat's house. Now, maybe the General Assembly adds, provisions saying they should all be baby maple trees planted at Pat's house, so they can add on kind of modifications to that federal law. But those federal dollars flow through the budget and they will be appropriated there kind of for them to spend. So like all the IIJA money for transportation is included in the existing budget. It's added to the various categories where they will be spent. And occasionally, again, the Assembly will add additional requirements above and beyond those kind of federal policies, but nothing they do in the bill is going to be able to, undo those federal requirements. So, Virginia's getting $106 million out of the IIJA for electric vehicle charging stations. There is actually budget language in there that directs the Commonwealth Transportation Board to develop a process for allocating those funds and to develop a plan that shows how they, intend to allocate them. But there's nothing the Assembly could do to say, go use this money to widen a road somewhere, because that would be in violation of the federal statute.
All right, that's helpful. Thank you. And if you have any other questions, this is your opportunity. Make sure there are questions regarding what we're talking about here today. Monique offers, she first says, thanks for an excellent presentation, but she asked a good question. Is there an official budget scoring group that reviews or adds credibility to estimated budget amounts, like there are at the federal level?
I don't think so. I think the only score I know of is the one that you receive from, is it from DPB, that when they're asked to score a bill and give you an estimated cost, or from the agencies themselves that would have to execute that bill, they will give their estimate of how much it would cost them to do it. But I don't believe that there is an independent scoring entity that is looking at the bills and offering their opinion if what the agency said is accurate.
Yeah, that's Anna hit it dead on there. So there's something called a physical impact statement. And so anytime a bill potentially, quote, has a physical impact, the agency can submit a statement outlining those impacts, whether they need to hire new staff, whether the costs are one-time or ongoing. And again, they will send that to the Department of Planning and Budget, as Anna said, and then those will be sent to the legislature. But also, as Anna said, there's no CBO. The legislature itself doesn't have an independent office that scores it. The agency writes what it thinks and sends that to the legislature. And those things can be, very interesting. Sometimes a bill that clearly has a cost does not have a financial impact statement, which is kind of like a wink and a nod that, the agency really wants to do that and they're very happy to do it. And don't worry, everybody, nothing to see here, let's pass this. Other times, you might see a physical impact statement on a bill and you're like, why does that cost money? And, that can be a sign that perhaps like the agency has some reservations, is the word I'll use, with maybe the policy kind of in that bill. But that's kind of what you can see there. And that also can become like an area of conflict if the member submits a budget amendment request, as Anna said, that goes along with their bill for, say, $2 million. And then the agency puts in a physical impact statement that says, well, it's $4 million or other things like that. And so those are some of the tough issues the Assembly has to deal with as they, again, cobble together this very, very large document.
Well, I appreciate that. On that point, so if you're asking, if you put forth a bill, it has a fiscal impact associated with it, then what should an individual be doing in their advocacy? Should they also be asking, what processes should you go through in order to make sure you get a bill through that isn't just going to be unfunded and then therefore go away?
I guess you could do a bunch of different things depending on the political situation of your bill. So you could have chatted with the agency ahead of time, if you're comfortable kind of sharing the outlines of what you were going to do with the agency, and just kind of ask them for information about what do they think it would cost for them to do this. They can't give you a we like it, we don't like it, but they can give you factual information about how it might be implemented and what the costs would be. And you can plan for those before you walk into the General Assembly. You can be talking to your legislator about that, finding a way to fund that impact. You could, if you don't agree with what the agency estimates, you could give your legislator, equip them with a lot of information about why that's not true and why they could cover the cost or why it's not that much. And they can try to make that case with the committees and the money committees at the appropriate time. You can also prepare the money committees with that same information and go, we think that's a little bit inflated. Here's what we think it would actually be. But that's, it's at their discretion. They could believe you, they could not believe you, it's their call. And then, if you do truly think there's a budget impact, you can prepare that budget amendment and be ready to fight for it just as hard as you fought for the bill itself. So those are the ones I came up with. Nick, do you have any others?
You have everything you would do for a budget amendment, you have to do for the bill, and vice versa. If you focus on one, like you're not focused on the other, you're not going to be successful. Or most likely not going to be successful, I should say. There's always surprising things that happen, but they're equally important. And again, it's not fun to have a bill that says go spend money and the budget has no money for it, because then you have a very, very nice piece of paper that says all the things you like and nobody's doing it. And so they're of equal importance there. And we talked about the budget development process, but keep in mind that the legislative development process for agencies is also underway. And so all of these things, they're really 12-month cycles. But we spend a lot of our time focusing on when the assembly's actually in town. And my just real encouragement to all of you all is to also focus on when they're not here, because it's the prep work that's done before everyone gets in Richmond a lot of times that determines whether or not you are successful. Session is it is unwieldy. There's 6 a.m. subcommittee meetings. The legislators have dinners and other things they're going to. And so these can be 18-hour days that are just truly grueling and exhausting there. And that's just a really hard time for someone to understand a new concept or a new idea and to get up to speed and to really be a great champion for you there. And so you've really got to talk to these folks in advance. As Anna said, now is the time. And really, I think she said it great in the first slide. Yesterday was actually the best time. Today is the second best time. Tomorrow's third best, so on and so forth. I can keep going there, but you get the point. And so really talk to these folks now about these issues and why they're important.
Thank you both. Larry asked a question here, and I know VCN works with our partners largely at the state level and focusing on Richmond and budget processes as well as bills. But he's very thankful, says these presentations have been outstanding. He's going to follow your general approach to try to get policy and budget approval for conservation projects at his county level. And he's asking for any thoughts you have on how county or locality leadership processes are different from those at the state.
They're quite different. Larry, I don't mean to give you a non-answer there, but cities are different than counties. Each county is not necessarily the same as each other. The really frustrating part for many local governments is so much of their funding is passed through money through the state. And so a lot of times you will see a rush of county and local budget activity after the state budget is passed, because they don't know what level of education funding they're getting. They don't know what level of police and other funding that is a lot of it is really passed through from the state to them that they're going to be receiving. And so oftentimes what a local government can do is dependent upon what level of funding they're receiving from the state. So if the states reduce education funding, that doesn't mean the schools cost less. Maybe you can do some things to reduce cost at a local level, but typically means is the local general fund will have to increase its support for education, which then can constrain the other things that local funding could kind of go to. So I know I'm not answering your question. Anna may have a great answer there, but every local government is different there, but there is a lot of interdependency between the state and local budgets.
Yeah, I agree. I think you may find the same big level components. So you may find that there is some sort of public hearing format. There is some time scheduled for the local government to hear from their constituents about priorities. There's probably some way for local electeds to put in requests. There's probably some executive or manager who's going to create a proposal or, at the end of the day, draft something together that everyone then takes a pen to. So the big picture is similar, but the individual details of how your locality is going to make that function, you're going to have to dig into and make sure you know the dates, deadlines, and who's doing what. One thing I will mention, kind of taking us back to the state process, often localities or maybe the groups of localities are going to put forward some priorities that they want their state representatives to take into consideration. Sometimes it's good to know if your priority matches with your locality's priority, because this money does trickle down. So be aware of maybe what your locality is asking their state representatives to do on their behalf, and seeing if you can either influence that or if you can make a case that your priorities match.
Wonderful, very helpful. I believe that wraps up all the questions we have at this moment. Appreciate all of your time, all of our presenters today. And that's not all. What do we do from here? I'm going to hand it right back over to Kyle and Andrew Pero with VCN on the process moving forward.
Hey, everybody. And again, thank you to our speakers so much for coming today. Really appreciate it. Nick and Anna loved, especially the idea that we should be talking to our legislators yesterday. For folks here on the call, if you haven't heard that half a dozen times today, hopefully you hear it 3 dozen times more before the start of assembly. That is the most crucial thing that we could be doing now to advocating for the positions that we know and support, because you got to be sure that folks who are on the other side of your issue are doing the same thing with their legislators and yours as well. So we really want to make sure that we're talking to them consistently on a regular basis. I just have a couple of pitches here for the next upcoming couple of weeks and months here. Next Thursday, a week from today at 11, we're holding our upcoming next education series on the briefing book on land and wildlife conservation. So again, that's November 3rd at 11. So hopefully we'll see you all here for that. The biggest thing that we have coming up is our General Assembly preview, and that's going to be held on Saturday, December 3rd from 9 to 12. This year, we're really excited to get it back into a hybrid format where we'll be hosting folks in regional offices across Virginia, and we'll be able to broadcast some really great speakers talking about what we can expect during the upcoming General Assembly. And of course, the biggest takeaway from that is to talk to your legislators. And so these meetings will give you a chance to not only meet with local activists, meet with your neighbors, but hear from the experts in the field who will give you all of the information and knowledge you need to have these great conversations with your legislators. If you're looking for something to do in the interim before that December 3rd meeting, we would strongly suggest you go to our website, vcn.org, and go to our Take Action banner. And on that portion of our website, there's a ton of really great slides and presentations and resources on how to be an effective advocate. There are numerous ways you can get involved other than talking to your legislator. There's a bunch of different options that you can have. So take a look at that. Feel free to download those. Those are some really, really great resources. Highly recommend that. With that, those are the big things that I wanted to plug. For any other questions, I'll hand it back over to Kyle. But again, thank you for everybody for being here today and for our speakers. This was a great presentation.
Hi, everybody. Again, thank you to all of our authors and all of our presenters, and thank you, Andrew, and thank you to all of our logistical staff that helped us today. As Andrew mentioned, if you have any more questions, please feel free to reach out to the appropriate author as well as Pat or myself, and we'll make sure you get to the correct person to answer your question. Next week, we have our final education series event, Land and Wildlife Conservation. That's going to happen on November 3rd, Thursday, same time, 11 to 12:30 p.m. With that said, I hope y'all have a great rest of your day and see you next Thursday. Bye, everybody.